People say blood is thicker than water, but for $500 million, most folks would sell their own mother for a bucket of it. Vespera Graves sat in a kitchen that smelled like wet cardboard and old grease, staring at a tea bag that had given up the ghost an hour ago. Her husband was barely in the ground, and already the vultures were circling the wagon. They didn't have the foggiest idea she was sitting on a mountain of gold. They just saw a widow about to lose her shirt. It was time to see who was really in her corner and who was just waiting for the chips to fall. The proof is in the pudding, and Vespera was about to serve a very bitter dessert. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And what a beautiful soul you are for being here today. Before we dive in, I just want to take a moment to appreciate you. Yes, you aren't the one who chose this story out of everything else the internet was offering you right now. That wasn't an accident. Maybe you needed this story. Maybe this story needed you. What you're about to experience is not just entertainment. It's a mirror. It's a question. It asks, if everything was stripped away, the titles, the money, the status, who would still show up at your door with groceries and no agenda? Vespera Graves is about to find out. And somewhere in her journey, I have a feeling you're going to find something out about yourself too. So get comfortable, make yourself a cup of something warm, and let's begin. But first, a small blessing, just for you, before the first word of this story lands. May you never sit in a cold kitchen wondering who actually loves you, but may the people at your table be there for you, not for what you carry. May you always know the difference between someone who shows up and someone who is simply waiting. And may every cup of tea you make, even the ones gone cold, remind you that warmth can always be renewed. Go well. Now, let's begin. Oh, and one more tiny thing before we go. If something about this story already has you curious, if that blessing landed somewhere real in your chest, it would genuinely mean the world to me if you considered subscribing. Not because you have to, but because there are so many more stories like this one waiting for you here, and I'd love for you to be around when they arrive. A like takes 2 seconds and tells me this kind of content matters to you. Now, and in the comments, I'd absolutely love to know, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your city, your country, even just a flag emoji. I read every single one. Truly. Now, let's get into Vespera's world. The kitchen was small the way a fist is small. Compact, capable of doing real damage. Linoleum the color of old mustard. The pattern worn off near the sink, where Thorne used to stand, washing his hands for too long, the way he always did after a day at the salvage yard. 22 years of that man, washing his hands until they cracked. And now his hands were folded under 6 feet of October clay. 48 hours. That's all it had been. The stack of bills on the counter wasn't theater. That part was real, or had been real once. The electricity notice with its red border. The second mortgage statement from 14 months ago that Thorne had tucked behind the microwave and never mentioned. The credit card with the $4,200 balance from when the truck needed a new transmission. She'd left them out. Not to deceive anyone, not exactly. More like she was reminding herself of the version of her life that everyone else was still inhabiting. Because here was what nobody in Thorne Balthazar's extended family. And Lord, did that man have an extended family? Cousins breeding cousins like rabbits in a field? Here was what none of them knew. Thorne had been smart, in the way quiet men sometimes are. Not flashy about it. He'd spent 20 years building Balthazar Industrial Supply into something respectable, then sold it to a private equity firm in 2019 for a number that made the lawyer read it aloud twice. The money went straight into a Revocable Living Trust, carefully structured, with Vespera as the sole successor trustee and beneficiary upon his death. No probate, no court filings, no public record. The trust held everything: the liquidated sale, the real estate portfolio, the diversified investments. Thorne's attorney Wendell Prock had managed so quietly that even Vespera had to remind herself the numbers were real. $512 million, give or take. The beauty of a Revocable Living Trust was its invisibility. When a person died with a will, the will went to probate court. Public record. The whole world could walk into a courthouse and read every line of it. But a trust didn't go through probate. It transferred privately, directly, according to the trust document, which was locked in Wendell Prock's firm safe and existed as a legal instrument as real and binding as anything on earth, but as visible to the outside world as smoke. The family could search every database, hire every paralegal, spend every dime trying to find Thorne's estate. They'd find the house, the 2 trucks, the salvage yard that had been sold years ago. They'd find the appearance of a working-class man who died leaving his wife with not much more than regrets and outstanding debts, which was exactly what Vespera was going to let them believe. She dunked the dead tea bag one more time, watched the water stay clear, and set it on the edge of the cup. Outside, a car door slammed. Then the sound of heels on the front porch. Aggressive heels, the kind that announced themselves. The storm door screeched open before anyone knocked. Nobody in Thorne's family ever knocked. Lowry Quinnell came through the door, the way weather comes through a cracked window. She was Thorne's younger sister by 11 years, 51 years old, with the disposition of someone perpetually owed an apology, hair dyed the color of a penny left in the sun. She wore a black blouse that was silk, or pretending to be, and she had a pocketbook slung over her arm that cost more than Vespera's truck. "It's freezing in here," Lowry said, not looking at Vespera, already scanning the kitchen the way a real estate agent would scan it. Eyes moving to the ceiling for water damage, to the corners for signs of neglect. The thermostat's at 64. Vespera wrapped both hands around the cold mug. "What, trying to keep the bill down?" Lowry made the sound she always made, somewhere between a sigh and a judgment, and set her pocketbook on the counter without asking. She opened the refrigerator, stared into it, closed it. "There's nothing in there," she said. "There's eggs." "Vespera." Lowry turned around and arranged her face into something that was working hard to look like concern. "We need to talk about what comes next, practically speaking. Thorne's been dead 48 hours, Lowry." "I know that. I know that." A pause. The kind of pause designed to demonstrate sensitivity without actually being sensitive. "I just think it's better to face these things head-on instead of letting them pile up. The bills alone." She glanced at the counter, the stack of papers. Her eyes did something involuntary, something quick, like a tongue checking a sawtooth. "I'll manage the bills." "How?" Lowry pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down, uninvited. "I mean that kindly. I do. But how practically are you going to manage? The house is mortgaged, isn't it? The trucks aren't worth much. Thorne never had life insurance. I know because I asked him, and he said—" She stopped, caught herself. Because asking your brother about his life insurance while he was alive was the kind of thing you didn't want to highlight while his wife was sitting across from you 48 hours after the funeral. Vespera looked at her. Lowry cleared her throat. "I'm just saying there are options. programs. There's that women's shelter on Dupont that does transitional housing for... I'm not going to a shelter, Lowry. I didn't mean it like that. Then how did you mean it? The kitchen went quiet. The refrigerator hummed. A car went by outside, slow, the way cars go by on residential streets on grey October afternoons. Lowry smoothed the front of her blouse. I wanted to ask you about Thorne's watch. Flat, clean, no warm-up. There it was. The Patek Philippe. Lowry's voice went careful. The way you go careful when you're about to take something. He wore it every Sunday. It was our grandfather's. I just think it should stay in the family. Since you two never had children, I thought it made sense for it to come to me. Vespera set down the mug. The Patek Philippe had been appraised 3 years ago at $78,000. Thorne had worn it to church and to funerals and on their anniversary every year without fail. He'd worn it to the hospital in his last week, and Vespera had taken it off his wrist herself when they asked her to remove his jewelry for the procedure, and she'd held it in her closed fist for 4 hours in a waiting room chair, and it had left a red mark in her palm that took 3 days to fade. The watch is with his personal effects, Vespera said. I'll let you know. Lowry's jaw tightened. I'm just saying, before things get complicated, estate-wise, it'd be better to... I'll let you know. A silence between them, like a wall someone had just put up. Lowry stood, picked up her pocketbook, and did the thing she did when she was losing a negotiation. She straightened her collar and found something outside the window to look at, like the scenery had suddenly become important. I'll call you tomorrow, she said, and left. The Vespera sat in the quiet and listened to the heels down the porch steps, the car door, the engine. Then nothing but the refrigerator, the wet cardboard smell, the cold mug. She thought about Wendell Prock's voice on the phone 2 days ago, just hours after Thorne stopped breathing. Everything transfers to you immediately, Vespera. You are the trustee and the beneficiary. There's nothing to file, nothing to declare publicly. It's yours, all of it. Just say the word, and I'll begin the administrative process. She'd said, wait. And Wendell Prock, who had known Thorne for 25 years and who was the kind of lawyer who understood things without needing them spelled out, had said, for how long? And she'd said, I'll let you know. She'd met Thorne Balthazar at a tire shop. Not the romantic version of that story, not the movie version. She'd had a blowout on the I-78 and limped into his salvage yard looking for a replacement. And he'd been standing in the lot in a flannel shirt with grease under his fingernails. And the first thing he'd said to her was, that's not a blowout. That's a slow leak. Somebody's been putting too much air in. And then he'd fixed it for $12 and refused the $20 she tried to hand him. 22 years. No children. Which had been a grief that had calcified slowly into something else. Not acceptance exactly, more like accommodation. They'd accommodated around the empty space and built a life in the shape of themselves. Just the two of them, which turned out to be enough. More than enough, until suddenly it wasn't anything at all. Thorne had made his money slowly, without announcement. He was the kind of man who drove the same truck for 11 years, not because he couldn't afford a new one, but because the old one ran fine, and new things for their own sake struck him as a form of waste he found vaguely embarrassing. He'd built the supply company over 2 decades with the same principle. Find a thing worth doing. Do it until it's done right. Don't fuss about who notices. When the private equity offer came in, he'd called Vespera from the salvage yard parking lot and said, with that careful quietness of his, they want to buy the business. The number is unusual. Unusual. $512 million was his word for it. Unusual. He'd put it all in the trust, structured it so carefully that even his own sister couldn't find it with a bloodhound and a map. And not because he mistrusted Lowry exactly, he was too fair a man for that, but because he'd watched what money did to families, watched it the way you watch a slow fire, and he wanted the fire to have nowhere to start. And now Vespera was going to finish the experiment he'd started. She went to the bedroom. Thorne's closet still smelled like him, motor oil and the cedar blocks she put in every spring, and that particular warmth of a man who wore the same cologne for 30 years. She stood in front of his closet for a long time, with her hand on one of his flannel shirts. Then she went to find her worst pair of jeans. The family arrived in waves, the way bad weather does. By the end of the first week, Thorne's cousin Derek had stopped by twice, both times with his wife Petra, and both times with the same conversational structure. "How are you holding up? What a terrible thing, by the way, what's happening with the property?" Derek was in real estate, commercial mostly, strip malls and parking structures, and he had the habit of all real estate people, which was to look at anything standing still long enough and begin calculating its per square foot value. Thorne's uncle, a man of 74 named Otis, who Vespera had met perhaps 6 times in 22 years, called to say he was driving down from Scranton. He arrived with a casserole and a legal pad on which he'd written notes about estate planning considerations, in a handwriting that suggested he'd gotten help from someone more organized than himself. Lowry, of course, came every other day. She'd stopped pretending the visits were about comfort, and she arrived with coffee from the drive-thru and questions about paperwork, about the house title, about whether Vespera had spoken to anyone about the financial situation. She used the phrase financial situation the way doctors use condition, clinical, measured, implying that the patient should be worried. "There are options," Lowry said, on the 4th visit, sitting at the same kitchen table with the same posture of performed concern. "For people in your position." "What position is that?" "A widow, with debt, with a house that needs work." Lowry's eyes went to the ceiling, where there was a water stain from a leak Thorne had repaired 3 years ago. The stain remained, ghost of a problem long solved. "I talked to Derek, and we think, and this is just a thought, it's just a conversation, we think the best move might be to list the house before the market softens. You get the equity out, pay off the outstanding mortgage, and the remainder, it's not a fortune, but it's a start. You could get a small apartment, or the shelter." "I never said—" "You said it last week." Lowry's mouth went thin. "I said it was an option, a transitional, I'm not leaving the house." "Vespera." And now the voice dropped, got lower, got the particular tone people use when they're pretending to confide. "We're worried about you. We're all worried. You're alone in this house. You've got bills piling up. And frankly, and I say this with love, you don't have the resources to maintain this lifestyle. You never did." A beat. Thorne made decent money, sure, but a salvage yard in Jersey doesn't set you up for life. And it just doesn't. The word lifestyle was doing something interesting in that sentence, was implying that this house, this linoleum, this dead tea bag was a lifestyle, that Vespera had been living above her station, and now the station had come to collect. "I appreciate the concern," Vespera said. Lowry smiled the smile of someone who wasn't finished. "I just think we should get ahead of it, before things get embarrassing." Before things get embarrassing. There it was. The family's real anxiety, not Vespera's well-being, but the family's exposure to her potential poverty. A widow in a shelter was a story. A widow who gracefully sold the house and downsized was tidy, clean, something nobody had to explain at Thanksgiving. Vespera nodded slowly. "I'll think about it," which she would not do. It was the second Thursday after the funeral when Gage Miller knocked. He knocked. Actual knuckles on the door, 2 solid raps, the way a person knocks when they aren't sure if they're welcome, but they're going to show up anyway. Vespera opened the door to find him standing on the porch with 2 grocery bags and his cap in his hand, which he did sometimes, took his cap off when he was uncertain, as though his hands needed something to do. Gage was 46, big through the shoulders, with the mechanic's hands, permanently stained at the knuckles, no matter how much he scrubbed, which was something she only noticed now because it was so different from the hands of everyone else who'd been coming through her door. Everybody else's hands were clean. Gage's hands were clean enough, which was a different thing entirely. He'd been Thorne's friend for 16 years. They'd met at the salvage yard when Gage was starting his own shop and needed parts, and the friendship had built itself the way men's friendships sometimes do, through proximity and utility and the gradual accumulation of favors that were never counted because neither man was counting. "Brought some things," he said, nodded at the bags. "Gage, nothing perishable mostly. Pasta, soup. That bread you like, He stopped, started again. "The seeded one, from Kowalski's." She stepped back and let him in. He set the bags on the counter without making a production of it. He didn't look at the stack of bills. He didn't look at the water stain or the linoleum or the empty refrigerator with its 2 remaining eggs. He put the grocery bags down and asked where she kept her pot for the pasta. "You don't have to." "I know." He opened the cabinet she pointed to, found the pot. "You want to sit, or you want to do something with your hands?" She thought about it. Hands. So she chopped the onion, and he did the pasta, and they worked side by side in the small kitchen without talking much. And it was the first time in 2 weeks that the silence in a room didn't feel like a trap. No subtext in the quiet. No agenda in the chopping. He'd been at the funeral, of course, had shaken her hand after the service in the church parking lot with both of his, the way men shake hands when they're also saying something that doesn't have words, and then he'd stood to the side while the family milled around, not inserting himself, not making it about himself, just present, the way a solid object is present, something to lean against if you needed to. "How's the shop?" she asked. "Fine, backed up. Pete broke his collarbone last week, so it's just me and Danny." "I heard Pete fell off his roof." "He fell off his roof trying to clean his gutters in October." Gage shook his head. "I told him, every year I tell him, October is not gutter season." Something close to a laugh moved through her chest. Didn't quite make it out, but close. They ate at the kitchen table, and Gage talked about Pete's roof and Danny's new girlfriend, and a '68 Camaro that had come into the shop that was going to take 3 months to restore. And Vespera listened and ate and let the ordinary weight of it settle over her like a coat. He didn't say, "How are you holding up?" He didn't say, "What a terrible thing." He just talked about the Camaro, which had rust in places rust had no business being. And the conversation was a small mercy. When he left without ceremony, said he'd check in, meant it the way people only mean things when they don't announce it. And then he was down the porch steps and into his truck and gone. Vespera stood at the window and watched the tail lights until they turned the corner. In Wendell Proc's office, $512 million waited in a trust document, 3 mutual fund accounts, a real estate portfolio that included 11 commercial properties in 4 states, an investment account with a private equity firm, a life insurance policy separate from the trust, a personal policy Thorne had quietly kept current, for $7 million, with Vespera as beneficiary. And she was the second richest widow in Bergen County, and she'd just eaten canned tomato soup and pasta with a man who'd brought groceries because nobody else had thought to. The moment with Lowry and the bank statement happened on a Tuesday. Vespera had been out. A walk, just a walk. She needed to move her body or go insane, and she'd come back to find Lowry in the house. Lowry had a key. She'd borrowed it for emergencies 2 years ago and never given it back, and Thorne had been too polite to ask for it. And now Lowry was standing in the small study off the hallway, holding a piece of paper. "What are you doing in here?" Vespera said. Not a question. Lowry held up the paper. "I was looking for the mortgage documents. The ones you said were—" "I didn't say anything about mortgage documents." The desk drawer was open. Lowry set the paper on the desk with the particular careful gesture of someone putting something back after already having read it. "Vespera, is this a bank account?" The paper was a statement from a savings account Thorne had maintained separately, a small personal account he'd kept for miscellaneous expenses. Balance at time of closure, $487.33. Closed 18 months ago when he'd consolidated accounts. Vespera had forgotten it existed. "It's a closed account," Vespera said. "It's got your name on it, both your names." Lowry's voice had gone to that dangerous flat register, the one that meant she'd already decided what she thought, and was arranging her face around the verdict. "You have money in—" "Had. $487. That account's been closed for a year and a half." Lowry pointed at the number. "This says $400, Lowry. Not thousands, not millions. $487, and it's closed." The silence that followed was the silence of a person recalculating. Lowry's nostrils did something small and tight. "You've been letting us believe you're broke," Lowry said. "I have not. You let Derek come over here and suggest programs. You let Otis drive down from Scranton with his legal pad. Nobody asked Otis to drive. You've been sitting here playing poor." The voice went up. "And this whole time you've been— what? Sitting on a pile of $487, Lowry." Vespera kept her voice level. "Due to in a closed account." The two of them stood on opposite sides of the desk. Lowry's chest was moving faster than it should have been for a woman who'd just found evidence of less than $500. "I don't believe you," Lowry said. Quiet now. Quiet in a different way. Compressed. "You can call the bank." "I intend to." The numbers on the statement. Lowry picked up the paper again, looked at it, set it down. Her mouth did something complicated. "Thorne had money," she said. "Don't sit here and act like I don't know that. He sold that business." "For not much." Vespera had prepared this part, had rehearsed it in the mirror. The business had debt. There were partners with equity stakes. After the sale, after the debt, after taxes, there was enough to pay off the salvage yard property and put a little aside. And the little aside is what you're looking at. "That is not—" Lowry stopped. Her eyes moved around the study, looking for more papers, more drawers, more evidence of hidden wealth. "That can't be right. Thorne was a private man. You know that better than anybody." "I know he said he was private, but—" "There's nothing else, Lowry." Another silence. Longer this time. Lowry picked up her pocketbook from the floor where she'd set it and smoothed the front of her blouse. That gesture again, the one she did when she was losing, and walked to the hallway. "I'm going to look into this," she said at the door. "I want you to know that." "I know," Vespera said. "I know you will." Managing $512 million from a kitchen with a broken dishwasher was its own specific kind of absurdity. Which Wendell Prock sent documents by a courier. She'd asked him not to email anything. Not yet. Didn't want a digital trail that could be found in her trash folder or auto-synced to a device. So the courier came twice a week. A young man named Jorge, who had the discretion of someone who'd been told very specifically not to be curious, and Vespera signed things at the kitchen table and sent them back in the pre-addressed envelopes and then returned the table to its ordinary state of unpaid bills and old newspapers. She'd authorized Wendell to begin consolidating the accounts. Nothing flashy, nothing that required her signature on public documents. The real estate portfolio was already generating income. $2.1 million monthly from commercial lease agreements alone, which deposited automatically into the trust's operating account, which Wendell managed on her behalf. She didn't touch it. Let it accumulate, a decision she could revisit when she was ready to stop pretending. The thrift store had become her regular Thursday. She went for herself, not for theater. She genuinely preferred the weight of old denim, the specific softness of a flannel shirt that had been washed 100 times. She'd spent 22 years in the company of a man who'd owned a $400,000 watch and worn flannel to the grocery store, and his preferences had become hers in the way of long marriages, through osmosis and repetition and love. But there was something else in the thrift store visits now, something she caught herself doing, standing in the aisle between the coats and the men's shirts, looking for a flannel that smelled like cedar and motor oil. And obviously, none of them did. That was the thing about grief. It went looking for the dead in the wrong places, looking for Thorne in a thrift store flannel she'd never worn, touching the collar of someone else's old shirt. She found Thorne's watch on her nightstand every morning when she woke up. She'd put it there the day after the funeral. It sat next to her reading lamp like an artifact from an excavated life, still ticking because she wound it every few days without thinking about it, the way you water a plant. Lowry wanted it. Lowry was not going to get it. The psychological weight of the months, and it was months now, November into December, was a specific and peculiar pressure. Not guilt exactly, more like the dissonance of two truths in one body. The body that moved through the world as a widow barely managing, and the other body, the internal one, that received courier documents and signed authorizations and attended monthly phone calls with Wendell Prock, in which she made decisions about investment portfolios while sitting in her car in the parking lot behind the library so nobody would see her talking with the seriousness of a CEO. She was CEO, actually, of the trust. Trustee, which was functionally the same thing when you were also the sole beneficiary. A CEO in a dead teabag kitchen. The crack came on a Wednesday. Gage had come by again. Not with groceries this time, just came by, which she'd stopped questioning because it was becoming clear that Gage Miller simply appeared when he thought someone needed company and disappeared when he thought they needed space, with an accuracy that was almost unnerving. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of actual coffee, which he'd made himself because he'd noticed she kept the grounds in the second cabinet, and Vespera was leaning against the counter with her own cup, and they were talking about nothing in particular. And then Gage said, "You seem like you're carrying something." She looked at him. "Not grief," he said, reading her face. "I mean, yeah, that too, but something else, something with weight to it." She almost said it, felt the words assemble themselves. "Thorne left me everything, Gage, more than you could imagine, and nobody knows, and I've been watching them circle, and it's making me feel like something I don't want to be." Felt them right at the back of her throat. And then she put her coffee cup down and looked out the window at the dead November yard. "It's complicated," she said. "Most things are. This is more than most." He waited. He had the particular patience of a man who'd spent his career listening to engines. You wait for the sound that tells you what's wrong. You don't go poking before you know where to look. She stopped. Started again. "I just need to know something. About some people. And the only way to know it is to let things be the way they appear to be for a little while longer." Gage turned his coffee cup in a circle on the table. "Thought about that." "Okay," he said. "You're not curious? I figure you'll tell me when there's something to tell." She looked at him then. Really looked at him. His hands on the table. The grey at his temples. The small scar on his chin from a car hood that had fallen when he was 22. 16 years of Thorne knowing this man, and by extension, Vespera knowing him, and what she knew was this. He had never once asked her for anything. Not a favor, not a reference, not a handout. He'd borrowed Thorne's truck once, in 2018, when his own was in for repairs, and he'd returned it with a full tank and washed. "Thank you," she said. It came out strange, too full for the sentence to hold. He looked at her, just briefly. "Sure," he said, and picked up his coffee. She didn't tell him, but she came closer than she'd come to anyone, and the closeness had its own kind of cost. She went to the cemetery on a Saturday in early December. Cold but clear. The kind of cold that had an edge to it, without being cruel. And then she stood at Thorne's grave with her hands in her coat pockets and talked to him the way she'd been doing since October. Not the out-loud kind, just the internal kind. That running conversation the living have with the dead that might just be talking to yourself, but feels like something more. "I think I've been wrong about this," she told him. "Or right for the wrong reasons. I don't know which." The grave had fresh flowers. She hadn't put them there. She looked at them. Carnations, white, in one of those plastic sleeves from a gas station or grocery store. Someone had come to the grave on a Saturday with gas station carnations and left them and gone. She took a photo on her phone to ask Gage later if he knew anything about it. Then she got back in the truck and drove home. She pulled onto her street, and she could see, from 2 houses down, was that there was something different about her house. She didn't know what exactly. Something in the presentation, something wrong with the facade. She drove closer and pulled in front, and then she saw it. There was a real estate sign on the lawn. A red and white for sale sign from a brokerage she didn't recognize, planted in the frost-hardened ground at the edge of the property, professional and authoritative, and there. Her phone buzzed. A text from Lowry. "Called a contact at Marfield Realty. They can have a listing up by end of week. This is the right move, Vespera. You'll thank me. We can get maybe $310,000 for the house in this market." She sat in the truck and read the text 3 times. Then she called Wendell Prock. "It's time," she said. "I want to move forward, but I want to do it my way." She planned it for a Friday. The invitations went out the way all the meaningful events of Vespera's life went. Quietly, without announcement, with the precise minimum of ceremony required. She called Lowry. She called Derek and Petra. She called Otis. She called 3 others from Thorne's family who'd made the rotation of the visiting vultures, a nephew named Ray, a woman called Bet, who was a cousin twice removed but had showed up with a clipboard and a document she'd called an estate interest form, and Thorne's oldest friend from before Gage, a man named Clifford, who had stopped calling after the first week when it became clear there was nothing to be gotten. She called Gage too. "Dinner Friday," she said, when he answered the shop phone. The shop phone, because he always answered the shop phone, and his cell went to voicemail. Yeah?" A metal sound in the background. He was under something. "You cooking?" "Catering." A pause. "Vespera." "Casual," she said. "Just be there." "Okay," he said, and she heard him put the phone against his shoulder and say something to Danny about the talk on something, and then, "What time?" 7. "I'll be there." She spent Thursday with Wendell Prock and a graphic designer named Inez, who Wendell had used before for exactly this kind of thing, which was to say, the presentation of facts in a way that made the facts land with their full weight. Inez prepared documents, clean, printed, bound in simple cream-colored folders, 1 per guest. Wendell prepared a summary statement, 1 page, everything in plain language, because Vespera had specified no financial jargon, and she wanted every person in that room to understand every word without having to ask for a translation. She also spent Thursday at a property on the west side of Livingston she'd never visited, a house Thorne had bought in 2020 through the trust as an investment, a 7,000-square-foot property that had been rented for 2 years and was now vacant. Georgian architecture, brick, with white columns and a kitchen with marble countertops and 12-foot ceilings and floors that went tick-tick-tick when you walked on them, because the wood was old and honest about its age. It was, in the objective sense of measurement and material, a very beautiful house. Standing in the kitchen, with its marble counters and its wide copper sink, she felt approximately nothing. No warmth, no arrival. The faucet dripped, minor, and fixable, and the sound of it in the empty house was very clean and very cold. She went back to her own kitchen, with its mustard linoleum, and made herself dinner. The guests arrived Friday at 7, with the obedience of people who sense an agenda without knowing its content. Lowry came first, which was characteristic, and stopped in the doorway when she saw the caterer's table. Actual caterer, actual table, white cloth, and proper settings, and her face ran through several expressions quickly, like shuffling cards. "You hired a caterer," she said. "Sit down," Vespera said. The others came in over the next 15 minutes. Derek with Petra. Otis, who drove 2 hours again, who would drive 4 in snow if he thought the news was good enough. Ray, the nephew, who was 29 and had the permanent expression of a man waiting for something to be handed to him. Bet, who came with her clipboard out of habit and set it under her chair with the quiet embarrassment of someone caught with a weapon at a peace summit. Clifford, who had reappeared when the invitation came, who dressed up more than the occasion warranted, whose cologne was too strong for the size of the room. And Gage, who came last, exactly on time, not early, not late, in a clean flannel shirt and his good jacket, and who sat at the far end of the table with his hands on his thighs and looked at the assembled company, and then looked at Vespera with a question in his eyes that was patient enough not to need asking yet. The caterer, a woman named Doris, who radiated the professional composure of someone paid to be invisible, served the first course. People made small talk. The food was good. Vespera ate enough to be polite and watched her guests the way you watch weather. Lowry kept looking at her. Derek kept looking at the house, scanning it the way he always did, his per-square-foot instinct running without his permission. After the main course, Vespera stood. The table went quiet. "I want to thank you all for coming," she said. Her voice was steady. She'd worked at that, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted the words to have the weight of precision, not the weight of anger. "I have something to share with you, and I wanted to do it in person, all at once, because it concerns all of you. Doris," she nodded at the caterer, "would you mind?" Doris set the cream-colored folders at each place setting with the efficiency of someone dealing cards. The sound of the folders being opened, then silence. Not the ordinary kind of silence. Lowry was the first to get to the second page. Vespera could tell because Lowry's hand went flat against the paper, pressed it down, as though the numbers might escape, and her chin came up and her eyes went to Vespera's face. "What is this?" Lowry said. "The first page is the trust document summary," Vespera said. "You'll see Thorne established the Balthazar family Revocable Living Trust in 2019. The second page is the asset summary as of November 30th. The third page is a statement from Wendell Proc's firm confirming the current valuation. 500, Derek stopped. "And $12 million, Vespera said. "Give or take, and depending on the market." The faces. She'd imagined this moment, had run through the versions of it in her head for weeks, imagined tears, imagined rage, imagined the performance of emotions that weren't the real emotion. But imagination had not prepared her for the specific, physical reality of watching a room full of adults hit the same wall at the same time. It wasn't transformation. That word implied movement, process, a journey from one state to another. What happened to the faces around her table was simpler than that. More primal. Like watching animals that have been running towards something at full speed find, at the last instant, that the gap between the field and the feast is made of glass. Lowry's face. The skin around her jaw went tight. Her eyes did a rapid calculation. Not of the numbers in the document. Those had landed already. Those were already inside her. But of the months, the visits, the strategy of the shelter suggestion, the gentle pressure of the house listing, the performance of concern. All of it running backward through her head, like footage on rewind, and the footage looked different now. Looked like what it was, and the looking of it in Lowry's own eyes was a specific kind of suffering that Vespera did not feel sorry for. Derek's hand was still flat on the paper. His wife Petra had made a small sound, not quite a word, and now had her hand over her mouth. Otis. Poor Otis, who had driven from Scranton with his legal pad. His face had gone the color of old chalk. Ray, the nephew, put his folder down, then picked it up, then put it down again. Bet's clipboard was still under her chair. Clifford, who had come back for this, Clifford was looking at the tablecloth. "You knew," Lowry said, not loud, tight, like a word squeezed through something narrow. "You knew this whole time." "Yes. And you let us—" She stopped. Her jaw worked. "You let us come in here and talk about shelters." "I did." "Why?" Not a question. An accusation shaped like a question. Vespera sat down. She was done standing. "Because I needed to know," she said. "I needed to see who would show up when there was nothing to show up for." The table was very quiet. So, it was a test. Lowry said the word test the way you'd say an obscenity, with the breath behind it. "I prefer to think of it as clarity. You made us look like I didn't make you do anything." And there was no anger in Vespera's voice. She'd made sure of that. Everyone in this room made their own choices. I just didn't correct your assumptions." The silence after that was different from the silences before. This one had a texture. It was full of the specific discomfort of people confronting themselves, which is a different thing from being confronted by someone else. Worse, because there's no direction to aim the outrage. Then Vespera picked up the envelope from the empty chair beside her. She walked around the table to Gage, who had been sitting at the far end the entire time with his hands still on his thighs, watching her. Only her, not the documents, not the other faces. Watching her the way you watch something you're not sure you're understanding yet. She put the envelope on the table in front of him. "That's a check," she said, "for $10 million. For 16 years of being Thorne's person. For the groceries. For the seeded bread from Kowalski's. For the carnations at the grave." She paused. "That was you." He didn't look at the envelope. "Gage," she said. He was looking at her. He didn't pick it up. His hands stayed on his thighs, and his eyes stayed on her face, and the envelope sat on the table between them, like a door she'd opened that couldn't be closed. "Gage, I know what it is," he said. Quiet. The same quiet he had when he was listening to an engine for a sound. "Then, I heard everything you said tonight." He glanced, briefly, only briefly, at the envelope. "And I appreciate it. The thought. He stopped, pressed his lips together. "The carnations were $3.60. From ShopRite. I don't need $10 million to make those carnations mean something. That's not—" She sat down in the chair next to him. "It's not about the carnations. It's about what you did, what you kept doing. You deserve to be paid." His voice was still quiet, but something had moved into it. Something careful, like a person navigating around an object they don't want to break, but also don't want to pretend isn't in the way. "Vespera, that's not what I meant." "I know what you meant," he exhaled. "I do. And I'm not angry. I'm trying to understand." His hands came off his thighs, finally, and he put them on the table, both of them, palms down, mechanic's hands, stained knuckles. "You spent 2 months watching whether I'd show up, watching whether I'd ask for something, watching whether I was—" He stopped. "What was I? What were you looking for?" "I was looking for—" She wanted to say people who actually cared. The phrase felt insufficient in her mouth. "I just needed to know. Know if I was real." She didn't answer. Because that was it, stripped down. That was the bone of it. Gage nodded slowly. Not in agreement, in recognition. "Here's the thing," he said. "I knew Thorne for 16 years. I knew him when he had 20 employees, and when he had 200. I knew him when the supply company was making real money, and I knew him when the roof was leaking and he was working 17-hour days. And he never—" Gage's voice caught, briefly, and he cleared his throat. "He never once made me feel like a subject of study, like a case, like something being evaluated." The room had gone so quiet that the caterer had taken herself into the next room. The family at the other end of the table had gone very still. Lowry, with her hands in her lap, Derek not looking at his folder anymore, just listening. "I brought groceries," Gage said, "because my friend's wife was alone and there was nothing in the refrigerator. I came to the house because Thorne was gone, and I missed him, and being in a place he'd been helped. A little." He looked at the envelope, then back at her. "Not because I was auditioning for a reward. Not because I thought you'd check the ledger at the end and figure out what I was worth. A pause. But that's what happened, right? You were checking. I wasn't checking you. You were checking everyone. He said it without accusation, which was somehow worse. I was on that list. I was in that sample. Every time I knocked on the door, you were logging it. Somewhere in the back of your head. Gage came today. Gage brought bread. Gage is real or isn't real. Let's find out. She looked at the tablecloth. White from the caterer's supply, clean and pressed. Nothing to read in it. You were grieving, Gage said, and his voice softened on those words, the way it softened when he was giving something its due. And you were scared. I get that. I do. And after the way this family... He didn't finish the sentence, but his eyes moved briefly to the other end of the table, where the silence was embarrassed and thick. After all of that, I understand the impulse. You wanted to know who was standing on solid ground. Yes, she said. And now you know. Yes. But so do I. He put one hand on the envelope, not picking it up, just touching it, the way you touch something before returning it. I know you needed a test to trust me, after 16 years. He pushed the envelope back toward her, gently. That tells me something I didn't know before. She looked up. It was never about you not being trustworthy. I know that. He almost smiled. The beginning of one, the shape of one, that didn't finish. It wasn't about me at all. That's sort of the point. He stood up. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. You needed to run the test, and the test ran, and you got your answer. He looked at her for a long moment, a full, direct look, the kind that holds something complicated and doesn't flinch from it. I hope it was worth what it cost. She stood too. Gage, I'm not angry, he said again. I want you to know that. I'm just... He found the word carefully. Done, I think. He walked to the hallway. She followed him. Just the kitchen doorway, the coat hook, the front door. Gage, please. He stopped with his hand on the door frame, his back to her. She could see the line of his shoulders in the jacket. You want to know something about Thorne? He said without turning. He never ran a test on anybody in his life. He just decided to trust people. Some of them let him down. He dealt with it. And he never, not once, made the people who were good to him feel like they'd passed something. He opened the door. Cold air came in. December cold, with teeth. Take care of yourself, he said, and he was gone. The sound of his truck starting, the headlights crossing the front window, the sound of tires on pavement, going away, going further away, gone. The remaining guests at the dinner table had the collective grace to say nothing when she came back through the hall. Lowry stood up without a word and gathered her coat and her pocketbook, and the others followed her in the quiet choreography of people who have been reduced, one by one. Derek, who paused with his folder in his hand, as if deciding whether to take it, then left it on the table. Otis, who patted her hand at the door, just her hand, nothing else, maybe the most honest gesture he'd offered in 2 months. Ray, who looked at his shoes going out. Bet, who took her clipboard. Clifford at the door turned and said, "For what it's worth, I'm..." then stopped, looked at her. Never mind, and left. Lowry was last. She stood at the door with her coat half on and looked at Vespera with an expression that was too many things at once to have a simple name. Anger and shame and something that wanted to be grief but wasn't sure it had earned the word yet. "The house," Lowry said. "The sign comes down tomorrow morning," Vespera said. "I've already called them." Lowry nodded. Her chin moved upward slightly, the way it moved when she was swallowing something. "The watch," Vespera said. Lowry looked at her. You can come and get it, Vespera said. Not tonight. Call first, and then you can come and get it. Something moved across Lowry's face. Quick, gone. Why? Because he'd want you to have it. A pause. Not because you should have it. Not because you earned it. Because he loved you. And it was your grandfather's. I mean, those two things are true regardless of the last 2 months. Lowry opened her mouth and then closed it, put her other arm through her coat, nodded once, small, barely perceptible, and went. The house was quiet in the way of empty houses. The caterer had left efficiently, packing everything, wiping surfaces, taking the table back into the truck with the white cloth and the proper settings. The cream-colored folders were still at the places where people had sat. Vespera gathered them one by one, stacked them, set them on the counter. The check in the envelope was in her hand. She put it in her coat pocket. She'd cancel it on Monday. Call Wendell and cancel it. She stood in the kitchen. The bills were still on the counter. She'd kept them there out of habit, or out of some residual instinct of the performance, and now they sat under the overhead light, looking slightly absurd, a prop whose production had ended. She picked up the electricity notice, the red border. Final notice, it said, which was a lie. They always sent 2 more before they actually cut anything. But the red border was designed to produce fear in the person holding it. And it did. It still did, even knowing what she knew, even being who she was in the world now. The primal fear of not being okay, of the lights going out. She set it back down. On her phone, a text from Gage's number. Sent while he was already in his truck, driving away. Thorne was lucky to have you. I mean that. Be well. She read it 3 times. The words were clean and insufficient, and everything that needed to be said. She put the phone face down on the counter and looked at the kitchen. 6 weeks later, but she moved into the house in Livingston. She hadn't been planning to move, had been planning, vaguely, to stay in the small house with the mustard linoleum, the house that smelled like Thorne, because it did still, in the mornings, in the way that houses hold the habits of the people who lived in them long after the people have gone. She'd been planning to stay, but the sign Lowry had planted, even removed, had changed the house, had reminded her that the house was a thing that existed in the world, vulnerable to the world's definitions, and she was tired of defending it from people who had no claim on it. The Livingston house was hers, had been Thorne's investment, had become her inheritance, was now her home because she was the sole trustee, and she decided what was home. It was big, proportioned for entertaining, for a family, and for the life of a person with a public presence, none of which was Vespera's life or wanted life. The rooms echoed when she walked through them in the first week. 7,000 square feet of Georgian brick and 12-foot ceilings, and all of it saying the same thing in the same cold, echoing voice. This is what $500 million sounds like when you're in it alone. She set up in the kitchen first. Not the formal dining room, not the sitting room with its built-in shelves. The kitchen. Because the kitchen was the room she understood how to be in. The room where you were allowed to be ordinary. She brought her own plates, the ones she and Thorne had bought at a craft fair in Vermont 20 years ago. Slightly uneven because the woman who'd made them had been having an off day. She brought her own cups. She brought the kettle. She put Thorne's watch on the windowsill above the copper sink. Wendell Prock came to the house the week after she moved in. A brief visit, practical, going over some of the trust administration details, a real estate matter in one of the commercial properties, quarterly statements to review. He sat at the marble kitchen island with his briefcase and his reading glasses and his careful, steady manner. And when they were done with business, he closed his briefcase and took his glasses off and said, "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. He looked at her the way people who have known you for a long time look at you when they're deciding whether to push. "Thorne told me once," he said, "that you were the most perceptive person he'd ever known." He meant it as a compliment. A pause. I wonder sometimes if it's a complicated gift." She looked at the watch on the windowsill, still ticking. She wound it every few days. "I found out what I needed to find out," she said. "Did it help?" The kitchen was cold in December. The heat was still calibrating, something the building contractor was coming back to address. The marble counter was cold under her palms. The copper sink dripped the same way it had when she'd visited before she moved in. Minor, fixable, not yet fixed. "I know who loves me for myself," she said. "I have that. That's not nothing." "No," Wendell agreed. "It's not." He left shortly after, with his briefcase and his quiet, careful respect, and Vespera stayed at the marble counter, with her hands flat on the cold stone. The tea bag in her cup had gone pale. She'd made the tea 20 minutes ago and forgotten to drink it while Wendell was talking. She dunked it once. The water stayed clear. Through the window, above the copper sink, the December garden was bare. Brown grass, skeletal trees, the particular naked honesty of a yard in winter. Expensive garden, probably. In spring, it would do whatever expensive gardens did, bloom and structure and present itself. She'd deal with it in spring. The watch ticked on the windowsill. She thought about what it would take to call Gage. Had been thinking about it for 6 weeks. Not the call itself, but the structure of it, the architecture of what she'd say. How to say it in a way that wasn't just, "I'm sorry because I'm sorry" was accurate, but insufficient. And the way $500 million was accurate, but insufficient for the actual life she was living in the middle of it. She thought about what Gage had said. He never made the people who were good to him feel like they'd passed something. And she sat with the truth of that, the way you sit with a bruise, pressing on it just enough to know it's real. She had been afraid. Fear was the honest word for what she'd done. Not cruelty, not calculation. Fear. Fear of the people who'd come through her door with their clipboards and their concern-shaped greed. Fear that she was alone in the world, in the way that people who have just lost a 22-year marriage are alone in the world, stripped of the familiar context that made them legible to themselves. She'd run the test because she'd needed evidence, but she'd needed proof that at least one person was standing on something solid. She had the proof, and the proof had walked out the door. She'd call him. Not today, not because she was still afraid or still performing, or because she needed more time to figure out what to say, but because she wanted the words to be right when she said them, and the words weren't right yet. She was working on the words. There was a difference between not calling and not calling yet, and Vespera was committed to knowing the difference. In the meantime, there was this: the kitchen in December, the cold marble, the dripping copper faucet, the bone-white winter garden through the window, and Thorne's watch on the sill, ticking its patient, faithful tick, and the pale, useless tea, and the echo of 7,000 square feet, learning the sound of one person's footsteps. She picked up the cup, drank the cold tea in one long drink. Then she turned on the kettle. She was going to make it right, or she was going to try. And trying was the thing about living. It was never done. You didn't conclude. You just got up, and you made the next cup, and you tried again. The kettle heated. The garden stood in the cold. The watch ticked on the windowsill. Vespera stood at the marble counter in her dead husband's mansion, $500 million richer than anyone had known, and exactly as alone as money had always been and always would be. But the kettle was warm, the tea was coming, and she knew, with the specific costly clarity of a woman who had run an experiment and gotten her answer back, exactly who she was. That was something. It was not everything, but it was something. All right, now here's something I genuinely dare you to do. I dare you to sit with this ending and not think of someone in your own life who shows up like Gage does, quietly, without asking for anything back. I dare you to think of that person and not feel something. And if this story moved you, if Vespera's silence at that marble counter hit different, then I'm going to challenge you to do 3 small things right now before you close this tab or scroll away. 1. Hit that like button. Not for me, for Vespera, for every widow, every grieving person, every human being who has ever wondered who was really in their corner. 2. Subscribe, because if this story found you, the next one was made for you too, and I'd hate for you to miss it. And 3. Tell me in the comments, did Vespera do the right thing? Was the test worth it? Was Gage right to walk away? There is no wrong answer. I want your honest take. Go.